Welcome, and thank you for joining us for the next section in the University of Georgia Virtual Apple Grafting Workshop. I'm Ashley Hoppers. I am the University of Georgia County Extension Agent for Gilmer and Fannin counties in North Georgia, and we are so fortunate today to have Dr. David Lockwood, a longtime extension fruit specialist who has appointments with both the University of Tennessee and the University of Georgia. So Dave certainly has some strong roots in Southeastern agriculture, and he has a tremendous amount of experience in apple, particularly when it comes to apple varieties, rootstock genetics, and just homeowner application. So I think that we're going to have a great interview with him about some of the important considerations that any backyard gardener should consider when thinking about incorporating apples into their landscapes. So what I'm going to do now is, Dr. Lockwood, if you wouldn't mind sharing your screen, and we are going to ask him some questions that hopefully our viewers will find helpful as they continue their apple production journey at home. So with this being a workshop that's featuring Southeastern apple varieties, we thought it would be appropriate to kick things off discussing some heirloom apples. So Dr. Lockwood, my first question for you is going to be about apples in general. I know that apples are almost synonymous with American history, cuisine, and culture. So I'm curious, are apples native to the United States?
Okay, well, Ashley, that's a real good question. And the answer to that is no. Actually, as we move along, apples, let's see if I still move. Apples were thought to have originated in Central Asia somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 years ago, and then spread into Europe. And they didn't make it to North America until about the 17th century when the European colonists brought them over. Now, crabapple is native to North America, but that's the only apple. So the apple as we know it, no, it's not an American thing. It was introduced. And actually the first apple orchard planted in the New World was traced back to Boston, but it was planted in 1625 by Reverend William Blackston. And it's gone from there. There are a lot of apple varieties, depends on the sources. Some of them will say over 7,000 varieties. Other sources actually put it over 14,000 varieties of apples out there now. So it's a real, it's a worldwide crop, but it's one that was introduced to our country just a few hundred years ago.
Wow, that's fantastic. And you piqued my curiosity about the crabapple. So why is it our only one? Can you tell me a little bit about the crabapple?
I honestly don't know why that is. And it's interesting because it's closely related to the fruiting apple. Obviously, we use it for rootstock. It's been used in rootstock development. We use it as a pollinator. So, genetically, it's got to be very close, or else it wouldn't work in either of those applications. But why crabapple is here and none of the larger fruiting apples, I have no clue.
We'll chalk it up to one of nature's oddities and leave it at that. So,
yeah.
And I certainly know that you can use them for pectin sources in your jellies. So yes. We've definitely done that before. But great. Okay, thank you, Dr. Lockwood. I guess if we're done speaking about kind of the origin of the apple, I've got another question for you. And you kind of hit on it when you were speaking about all these thousands of varieties. It sounds to me like apple readily hybridizes and cross-pollinates. It seems like a highly heterozygous species. Can you tell me about how we propagate these apples and how do we end up with so many different varieties, and how do we stabilize those so we can make sure that Yates apple stays a Yates apple?
Okay, yeah, we can talk about that a little bit. First off, two different propagation techniques that we'll talk about with development of an apple variety. The sexual propagation basically is growing the seeds out from an apple, and all woody, or not all, but most woody species of plants are highly heterozygous. That is, that they cross-pollinate with other trees of the same type of fruit, or the same type of hardwood tree. So that means that they don't grow true to type from seeds. So if you plant out a bunch of seeds from an apple that you have on your property, what you get when those trees finally get up and bearing may vary considerably from the parent tree, or vary considerably from one seedling fruit to another. But this is a good thing, because the variation that we see gives the breeders a chance to look at a lot of different seedlings and identify the ones that have desirable traits. Once they've identified that desirable traits, then we use vegetative or clonal propagation to retain those traits. So sexual propagation or seedling growth is highly variable, but with clonal propagation, essentially, you can be almost 100% sure that the tree you get and the fruit you get off of that tree will be identical to the tree that you took the bud or the scion wood from and grafted onto the rootstock. So vegetative propagation is just regenerating a new plant from vegetative parts on the plant, not the seeds. And so it's kind of step two, getting from that desirable characteristic to getting that tree in your hands and being fairly certain that you've got what you wanted, what you purchased.
Absolutely. So instead of planting the seeds out of that Granny Smith apple, grafting it is going to be that insurance you want to make sure you have that guaranteed variety and not that genetic variation from cross-pollination, right?
Right. And you know, that's one of the major premises behind the heritage orchard that you're involved with, because we want to make sure that we save the trees that have desirable characteristics, even though we may not be able to identify the name of that fruit.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was great. Thank you, Dave. And it's kind of teed off perfectly to my next question. So when we talk about vegetatively propagating these apples and grafting them, which is what the whole point of this course is about, I'd like for you to tell me a little bit more about what are some of the main benefits, other than stabilizing the scion portion of the plant and having that guaranteed fruiting portion. What are some other main benefits of grafting as opposed to, say, just trying to root a cutting?
Okay, let's see. I might have a slide out of place here, but actually we'll back up and just cover that anyhow. When we graft, like you said, we maintain the scion or the variety, and we can be quite sure that we've done that. So we graft onto a rootstock that's selected for its desirable traits, and the rootstock scion combination will give us the tree that hopefully we want in our orchard. We'll select rootstocks based on size control, the precocity, how quick does it bring a fruit into bearing, disease resistance, whether it's fire blight or Phytophthora, insect resistance, as in the case of woolly apple aphid, nematode resistance, adaptability to dry soils or wet soils, and also for recently we're seeing adaptability to apple replant situations. So there are a lot of different features that we can get in the tree based on the selection of the rootstock and the variety that we use in our orchards.
Fantastic, thank you. And it sounds to me that you gave an excellent list of the reasons why we would want to select a rootstock to graft the scion onto. So it sounds to me like there's probably a lot of rootstock options out there, especially considering what we were discussing earlier with all those thousands of varieties and how readily we get new varieties and through these breeding programs. So tell me a little bit about some of these other varieties. You know, I'm guessing that there's not one best option for every situation.
Right, you're right. And let's scroll up to a slide that talks a little bit about rootstocks. And way back when, and I'm talking about before the early 1900s, apple rootstocks were either seedlings, we grew out seeds and grafted onto those, or there was actually a seedling selection called Paradise that was used a lot, especially in Europe. But researchers at the East Malling Research Station in England looked at 17 selections of Paradise and found out that there were differences. Some trees grew bigger than others, some started to fruit earlier than others. And so from that came the first clonal propagation of rootstocks, and some of those rootstocks that were released in the early 1900s are still in use today. Malling 9 and Malling 7, for example, I think were released in the early 1920s and are still very, very prominent in apple production today. We moved along into the 1950s. The Malling Merton series was released, and this utilized some of the original East Malling selections, but they were able to incorporate woolly apple aphid resistance along with that, and which is a very important thing because woolly apple aphid is a serious insect pest for us in our area as well as other parts of the world. And over the years, we've seen increased interest in rootstocks from different parts of the world for their adaptability as far as giving us the trees they want. We've got rootstocks now from Russia, Bud 9, which is very, very in demand right now as a full dwarfing stock, or Bud 118, which is a very large semi-dwarf. We're seeing some rootstocks out of Poland. And of course, the ones that we see a lot of now are the rootstocks out of Cornell, the Geneva series, that'll give us size ranges all the way from a 4 to 5 foot high tree on up to almost a standard size tree. And these rootstocks, in addition to size control, give us some of the traits that we talked about just a minute ago.
Fantastic. And you've also piqued my curiosity a bit. So we discussed how we clone scions through grafting, but how do you tell me a little bit about the cloning process for apple rootstocks? How do I make sure I end up with that Bud 9 rootstock?
Well, yeah, and that's very important because just like the varieties are vegetatively propagated, the rootstocks are also vegetatively propagated. So we'll I thought I had it. We'll do what we call mound layering the rootstocks. That is, you find a desirable rootstock shoot, and then we'll plant it, cut it off, and it'll sucker around the cut surface. And as those shoots grow, we mound those little succulent shoots with soil or moist sawdust and continue to grow it throughout the summer months. Keep adding a little bit more sawdust and keep it moist, and they'll actually root into that sawdust. So by the end of the growing season, we can pull the mound away and we can cut off that new shoot that now has roots on it, and that is our rootstock, and it is clonally propagated. So if we know what it's going to do, and then we can use that to graft the varieties that we want on it to get the desired combination.
That is so neat. Thank you so much. And since we're on the slide that you're on now, I would love for you to walk me through some of the options. You know, for this class, we're using 7 rootstock as our propagating material, M7. So make sure you kind of point out where that is in the spectrum of size and just kind of tell us about the different options.
Okay, this slide shows a full range of rootstocks from the full dwarf, from things like Bud 9 or Geneva 11, Malling 9 337 or G41, on up and progressively bigger. Now, normally when we get to about between 45 and 50% normal size tree, we'll go from what we consider to be a dwarfing rootstock up into a semi-dwarf, And the Mounding 7 or G202 out of the Geneva series is what we generally regard as the smallest semi-dwarfing rootstock that we work with. And some of the characteristics, in addition to size, is that as you get below the Mounding 7 size, quite often the trees that we get out of the full dwarf stocks are not self-supporting. We have to help with trellises or staking. And as we get up into the semi-dwarf, generally we've got trees that are self-supporting, but yet still a good bit smaller than the same variety on a seedling or a standard size rootstock. So Mounding 7 is about 55 to 60% of a normal tree. And then we can go all the way on up to 106, 111, or 118, which are about 80, 85% up to a full-size seedling tree. And I might point out that when we talk about an apple tree on a seedling rootstock, it's still a grafted tree. It's just that the rootstock itself was started from a seed, and then we grafted the variety onto it. And we've got a big tree. It doesn't produce early, and we've got a lot of variation because of the seedling rootstock. So that's why you don't see many seedlings anymore. We're all going to clone rootstocks so that the orchard is a little bit more predictable.
Man, and you just brought up such a good point. So, I think that's one of the larger reasons to not, just try to plant a seed out of the apple fruit, because, and you used the word precocity before. So how quickly will a plant come to fruit and come to bearing age? So
Right.
Can you just speak a little bit to the variability with when a seedling may fruit, and why that can be not necessarily the best idea when it comes to propagating?
Yeah, quite often if you grow out a seed and you wait for it to fruit, you're quite apt to be waiting 6, 8, 10 years or more before you would see the first fruit on the tree. And other varieties are even later than that. There's a variety called Northern Spy that is grown quite a bit further north, and it's quite common for it to be 14 or so years old before it'll ever start to fruit. And so economically speaking, you can't justify having that kind of tree. You need a return. Plus you want something that's going to have a little bit more manageable sized tree to work with.
Absolutely. And that's why your county agent will tell you, if you call asking why your seedling apple hasn't fruited, it's been 8 years, and you want to know when is it going to happen, and we say, I don't know.
That's right.
So that's just speaking again to that genetic variation, and truly a testament to how meticulous it is when you're trying to isolate these different varieties and find a good one that will not only have fruit quality, but precocity and things like that. So that's great information, Dr. Lockwood. And it kind of makes me want to know, I know we're propagating our own apples in class, but you're only getting 5 different varieties, and this might inspire you to want to go out to a nursery or some other outlet to try to get some more trees. And as a county agent, I get a lot of phone calls from folks who aren't really sure what they've got, asking me to try to identify apples that have been planted for several years. What tips do you have for the home gardener for if they are going out to a big box store or a nursery looking for apples? How can they be sure they're getting the variety on the appropriate rootstock for their needs?
Yeah, and that's a real big issue. And the best thing I think we can say is go to a reputable nursery to purchase your plant stock. They should be able to tell you not only what variety it is, but what rootstock it's planted on. And realize that nursery does not have to be a local nursery. In fact, a lot of the apple trees that we plant in the Southeast come out of Washington State, Pennsylvania, New York State. As long as the nursery does its job right, a good quality nursery can give you the variety you want on the rootstock that you want, so that you know what to expect. You don't have to wait that 4 or 5 years and then find out that that apple that you were really waiting and hoping to try isn't out there. You've got something entirely different, and it may not be one that you like at all.
That's a good point. And then also, when you were speaking about that mounding technique for propagating rootstocks, I know from experience, some rootstocks behave differently than others in terms of suckering. Can you speak about what to do, like once these plants, and I know M7 does tend to sucker a little bit. Can you speak about what folks should do, just kind of maybe a few years down the road? We've successfully grafted after this class, and how do we make sure we maintain a healthy graft union in the yard, and just rootstock maintenance?
Okay, yeah, that all starts out back at planting time. After you've got that tree grafted and it's ready to put out in its permanent site, when you set it out, make sure that the graft union stays above the soil line, but generally not over 2 to 4 inches above it. If you plant it too deep and cover that graft union, then you may actually, in the case of a full dwarf, see scion rooting, and now you no longer have a dwarf tree. If you plant it too shallow, the tree can be weak, and also you can see an abundance of what we call burnouts, or aerial rooting form, which is an obstruction in the trunk of the tree as far as movement of moisture and nutrients up and down the trunk, and you've got a weak tree now that's not as apt to survive as long or to perform as well. Also, and you mentioned root suckering, if you plant it too shallow, quite possibly you're going to see more suckering coming off below that graft union. And you want to make sure that you address that early on, preferably when those suckers are fairly short and fairly succulent, where you can pull them off the original tree. You'll get some return. That is, you can get some suckering for several years, but it should become less and less with time. So pulling those off and leaving that wound open to air and sunlight is the best thing to do. Also, don't get mulch up against the base of the tree. If you plant your tree at the right depth, but then you go put a mulch up against the trunk of the tree, it's the same thing as planting it too deep. You've just invited a lot of problems in that tree.
Thank you so much. And I believe that I've asked all of my questions. Do you have any last bits of wisdom you'd like to share with us?
Well, I guess when, if you're going to plant an apple tree, especially for the home orchard, give some special thought to some of the varieties that show disease resistance. They can be some of the old heirloom apples in an area, because a lot of them survived many, many years in the growing conditions that we have in the Southeast. And so they can be good. And old varieties, Arkansas Black is one we're not saying highly resistant to diseases, but it's not bad. It doesn't get many disease problems, and the fruit is good. It's useful. It's not necessarily as pretty as some of our new varieties, but when you come right down to being able to consistently grow a good, useful, high quality apple, it's that way. And so look around at some of the varieties that have been quite successful around you, and if you go beyond that, then look at some of the newer disease resistant ones to consider. Excellent.
And I will just make that announcement. Arkansas Black is part of the grafting kit, so congratulations, you have a variety endorsed by Dr. Lockwood. So with that in mind, I'm going to end this presentation and wish you the best of luck with your grafting endeavors.